As a newly fledged preacher, Trinity Sunday was one of the Sundays I always tried to avoid. Like many young Christians, every time I thought I was beginning to get my head around the word Trinity, and every time I tried to engage other people in talking about it, I realized that I was just another person who did not really get it. Well, I've been around a while now, and with all the benefit of hindsight, I think I can begin to understand more clearly some of the reasons for my difficulties. For example, I now suspect that the majority of the people who tried to teach me about Trinity as a young disciple, whether I listened to them speaking from the pulpit in a church or from the lectern in a seminary, did not really get it either. Rather than helping me, they often just seemed to muddy the water even further. So coming to Trinity Sunday 2020, after a break of several years, I am really quite keen to have another go and to see if I can provide something that at very least does not stir the mud any deeper. I apologize in advance if for some of today's listeners, yet again, I fail to deliver. There are, however, a few things I think I've learnt along the way that might just put me in there with a chance of making some progress. I've come to realize that the widespread assumption that talking about God as Trinity is automatically going to be difficult does not do us any favours. If I were to stick my neck out, I would say, if we cannot say it relatively simply, then it would probably be better if we did not say it at all. But that would be such a shame, because I've also come to realise that Trinity is potentially the single most important theological contribution that Christians have made that is worth sharing with other religions around the world. No other religion has ever tried to say anything quite like it. And I am convinced that it's not as inaccessible to people of other faiths as we might fear. If only we knew how to tell it without alienating people by simply compounding the muddle. Simple point number one, then. The only reason that Christians began to talk about God as Trinity, starting around the late 2nd century, was because other folk were accusing them of believing in 3 gods. And Christians were very keen to find a way of saying that they really do believe in one God and only one God, like most other religious believers. The problem was that the more they tried to explain themselves, the bigger the muddle seemed to become. They seemed to become ever more confused among themselves, and they certainly confused others that they were trying to convince. 2,000 years later, it is still not unusual for people to dismiss the Christian faith on the grounds that the word Trinity is fundamentally incomprehensible, if not downright contradictory. To put it bluntly, all too often when Christians talk about God as Trinity, it does sound very much as if they're talking about three gods. This is where I would suggest that we've been trying too hard and making it far more complicated than it needs to be. I want to maintain that Christians were never really trying to do a great deal more than simply to clarify their testimony to three fundamental dimensions in their experience of the one God. The one God who had most decidedly broken into their lives. In fact, much of their testimony was neither new nor especially controversial. In the Hebrew scriptures, we frequently encounter the kind of experience I have in mind. They were clearly there in our readings from Isaiah 40 and from Psalm 8. We can easily imagine both these writers, each probably on more than one occasion, standing under the immensity of the star-studded heavens and without any prompting, finding themselves worshipping God as the ultimate reason for all the wonder that spread out before them. It has rarely been disputed that any God worth calling God deserves to be known as Creator. It really has not helped, however, that far too casually Christians typically flip backwards and forwards, interchanging the word Creator with the catch or word that Jesus quite understandably used to describe his God, namely Father or Abba. But we interchange them as if they were simply one and the same. We do need to be very careful about that. Then there was another experience that our Hebrew forebears knew really well. When bad things happen, when the nation was defeated in battle and sent into exile, when their people experienced personal loss and terrible grief that followed, they were not at all slow to speak of God using the word Redeemer. The famous word from Handel's Messiah. I know that my Redeemer lives, began its history long before Christians ever arrived on the scene. It's a quotation from the book of Job. Now, there's a man, if ever there was one, who knew what it meant to wrestle with a redeeming God. Once again, it has not helped that we Christians all too often tell our gospel story as if God only really got into the business of redeeming during the life of Jesus, and particularly around the events that led to his death. Now, please don't get me wrong. I do not doubt at all that our rich Christian understanding of redemption owes an enormous amount to sustained reflection on the death of Jesus. But I do not think we should let this detract from the greater truth that God has always been as much Redeemer as God has always been Creator. From all eternity, we might say. Redeeming is what God does. Redeemer is who God is, who was and is to come, if only we have eyes to see it. Christians, I would argue, have been far too casual about the way they use another of those crucial words, namely the word Christ. Christ was never the surname of Jesus. After the resurrection, by starting to call him Jesus Christ, Christians were saying something about a profound insight rooted in Jesus into the eternal truth about God. One very distinguished Anglican teacher, John V. Taylor, in the mid-20th century, put it like this. Christians were testifying that their one God, yes, one God, is a Christ-like God. Christ-like. That is a little phrase that merits careful attention. Personally, I found it enormously helpful. The truth of the matter is that God has always been Christ-like, always putting God's own life on the line, even as we Christians now testify, it should lead to a crucifixion. Again, redeeming is simply what God does. Redeemer is simply who God is. And of course, Christians can never really forget it once they've been grasped by the stories of Jesus. You can probably guess now where I'm going next. There is a third experience of God that occurs everywhere in Scripture, and it will move us on to think about the word Spirit. It's the kind of experience that Abraham had, and Sarah, and Moses and Miriam, and prophets like Amos and Isaiah, and a whole choir of psalmists, and Mary and Joseph, and Peter, and Mary Magdalene, and Paul, and Priscilla, and on and on and on. To us, and to our own as yet unborn descendants. This is the kind of experience that makes us want to say that God is spirit, always has been, is, and always will be. The Hebrews gave spirit a first mention in their poetic story of creation. Isaiah said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." This is another of these realities that seriously religious people almost everywhere can sign up to. The problem here is when Christians begin to make it sound as if God as Spirit was a new invention on the Christian day of Pentecost. So let me backtrack. I began by saying that the whole point of using the word Trinity was to affirm that God is one and one alone. If you happen to find me on a particular day extolling God as creator, and on another day naming God as the unparalleled bearer of suffering love, Christ-like, you might say, and if on yet another you hear me getting excited about God as life-giving Spirit, please, please do not rush off and think I am juggling with three gods. This is one God, creator, redeemer, and giver of life, who was and is to come. I think I need to admit that I've cheated. I called it point number 1 and then slipped in 3 sub-points without really confessing what I was doing. Well, let's face it, it's Trinity Sunday. I do still have, however, a simple point number 2, and at the end of the day, it's probably the one that matters most, because it's where all this hits the road and bites into our daily experience. Post-Pentecost, which we celebrated last weekend, Christians now have an extraordinary insight into the way that God is always just ready and waiting to catch us up into God's own life, recreating us, redeeming us, and effecting a rebirth, all from above. Christians the world over bear daily testimony to the fact that when they do serious business with the life giver, a whole festival of renewal gets underway. So much so that many writers have compared it to being drawn into a joyful dance. We can find ourselves becoming more creative, energized by our Creator God. We can find in ourselves a new urgency to reach out in costly love, empowered by our Redeemer God. And from time to time, we can find ourselves getting more than a little excited about all this. Something, as it were, bubbles up in unexpected moments of joy, erupting from out the heart of our life-giving God. Every now and again, of course, someone gets a hold of all this big time. Abraham found God providing a desperately needed sacrificial lamb caught in a nearby bush. Moses found another bush, this one seemingly on fire without being consumed. Isaiah found the temple filled with what he could only describe as something like the train of God's garment. The disciples found Jesus on Horeb to be in some way transfigured. Paul found himself overwhelmed by a vision on the Damascus Road, and so it goes on and on. Our own stories might not be quite as dramatic as some of these, but we should never really be surprised when we hear very ordinary people, folk like you and me, talking about those strange moments in their lives when something rather bigger than themselves seems to break through, even if only briefly. Faith can go an incredibly long way on just one of those moments. And I can't help wondering if anything is coming to your mind out of your experience as I speak about this today. We use the word Trinity simply because it's really rather hard, impossible maybe, to do justice to all this rich experience of the one God without finding ourselves heading off in a number of different directions to make sense of it all. You've probably guessed that I'm not convinced that the experience at the heart of this word Trinity is a Christian exclusive. I've met people of other faiths, you might have met them too, who have similar testimonies to creative, redemptive, and life-giving encounters with God. But they do lack the word Trinity with which to express it. I know of at least one inspiring piece of writing that has attempted to share this word Trinity with our Muslim neighbours. There is something very profound here that deserves to be shared as widely as we can possibly manage. When we get to the end of this service this morning, I'm going to use one of my favourite forms of blessing, Trinitarian, of course. I will lead us in praise to the one God, Creator, Redeemer, and Life-giver, one God, who is at least all these things, and likely a great deal more. So whatever else you get from this sermon, please remember 2 simple points. 1, remember that the experience of the one God has always been immeasurably rich, creative, redemptive, and life-giving. And 2, remember that we are invited to be immersed into the life of this one God, to be drawn into God's dance and caught up into God's extraordinary festival of joy.